What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone's doing well out there today, where it's championship week for so many people. And Headliner Nation about to go stupid with the amount of titles we're about to walk away with. Now, I know for a large chunk of you, this is going to be your last week of fantasy football. Thank you so much for spending this season with us. We are truly blessed to have shared it with you. But don't go anywhere. Our off-season content is better than our in-season content, in my opinion. You do not want to miss out on it. And if you just so happen to play in one of those leagues that has championships in week 18, yes, we'll be here next week as well. We're not just here for the masses, we're here for everyone. And there's a lot of wide receivers we're going to look at in today's episode. But first, I got to try to continue my goal here to change some lives of kids suffering from extreme poverty. Now, we've been partnered with Compassion for almost the entire season so far here this year. Over that span, we've taken 12 children from extreme poverty and donated over $4,000 as a community to help these children in need. But the new year is right around the corner, and I'd like to continue changing lives throughout the world. So let's go ahead and take a look at this week's Compassion Kid of the Week. Everyone say hello to Ajara. She's 6 years old, lives in Togo, and has been waiting for a sponsor for 265 days. Is there anyone out there in Headliner Nation that is able to help little Ajara change her life? If so, I have a link down below in the description. It's to www.compassion.com/headliners. When you visit that site, you'll see our logo up in the top right-hand corner, and then you'll see a screen full of kids that are just looking for a little bit of help. Now, if you're looking for just Ajara, you can search by her child ID. We just flashed it up on the screen. But don't hesitate to scroll through all the other kids that need help in different places of the world. I would love to make this new year something special for this little girl, and we can change her life as a community. So like I said, if you're interested, visit compassion.com/headliners, and as a community, I know we can make a difference out there in the world. But now it's time to talk about some football, and let's go ahead and kick it off Thursday night with a matchup between the Jets and the Browns. And let's go ahead and kick it off right here with the Jets and talk about Garrett Wilson. He's the only one we're considering in New York still. And really the only reason we're even talking about Garrett Wilson in week 17 with the quarterbacks that he's had is because of targets. His quarterback play has been so bad this year that if he doesn't see at least 12 targets, he really can't be fantasy viable. Everything is just too dink and dunk down the field, and almost half of the targets that he does see aren't even catchable. This dude has 6 more targets and 5 more receptions so far this year than he had all of last season. However, he has 150 yards receiving less. And forget about touchdowns in this offense. They don't happen very often. Now a matchup going up against Cleveland. They allow the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Wilson could see himself some Denzel Ward this week as well. So that's something to pay attention to. With Zach Wilson still out, more than likely, we're getting Trevor Siemian here once again in his high-level play. Added to the fact that we're on the road in a very tough matchup, at least Cleveland is pretty banged up right now, and they do already have 10 wins. They have a 99% chance of making the playoffs, even if they lose this week. Maybe they don't have to force it too much, and that gives the Jets a window of opportunity to rack up a little bit of fantasy points. Either way, though, Garrett Wilson going to be hovering right around wide receiver 25 to 30 like he has been all year long. Which will then bring us down to Cleveland. And as for Amari Cooper, where the hell did last week come from? A season high in targets, receptions, and yards. Also had his longest reception of the season at 75 yards. Racked up 15 targets, 11 catches, 265 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns against Houston last week in week 16. At this point of the fantasy season, he is the only one worth considering in this offense. The others are basically out there fighting for scraps after Amari Cooper and David Njoku get theirs. Cooper has now had 37 targets over his last 3 games played, but this is not an easy matchup for him either. Going up against the Jets, they allow the lowest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers of any team in the NFL, and you gotta think that Amari Cooper gonna be dealing with a little bit of sauce out there in week 17. But with the way that Joe Flacco is currently playing, especially with this kind of being a revenge game, don't forget he played for the Jets just last year, and boy, how much better would the Jets have been this season had they just kept Joe Flacco, but that's That's it. That's for a different time, a different place. With all the injuries in Cleveland there on the Browns team and the matchup that Cooper has, I can't be overly high on him in my rankings. However, yes, he will still be in my top 24. Which then takes us to Saturday. Only one game on Saturday here this week. It's a matchup between the Detroit Lions and Dallas Cowboys. A couple of no-brainers here when we're talking about Amon-Ra St. Brown and CeeDee Lamb. Both these guys are top 5 fantasy wide receivers. Both of them are averaging over 16 fantasy points per game. Both of their teams are fighting for that number 1 overall seed in their conference. And with this game being played on Saturday and everyone else playing Sunday, they're going to have to try to win this ball game. But what about Brandin Cooks? He's definitely a guy that at times we've used here in good matchups during the 2023 season. It just hasn't been the case as of late. Over his last 3 games combined, he has a total of 6 catches for 61 yards and 1 touchdown. But really, the part that concerns me the most when we're discussing Brandin Cooks is only one time all year long has he had over 4 receptions in a game. And on the season, he's only averaging 3 catches for 39 yards per contest. He doesn't score a touchdown with the minimal chances he's given. You are absolutely screwed in fantasy football. But this matchup isn't bad. Detroit does allow the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. While I see the potential for this game kind of being a shootout, there is nothing safe in this matchup for Brandin Cooks. I really do consider him as one of those fringe guys here in week 17. If you're in desperate need, he has a good matchup. He has a potential high ceiling. He also has a potentially super low floor and will be a Verge top 30 play. Which then brings us to Sunday football. The first matchup, a good matchup. The Miami Dolphins and Baltimore Ravens will kick it off in Miami because at least we already know that we're not going to have Jalen Waddle here this week. Now, while they said his injury wasn't overly serious, they've also come out and said, listen, we're probably going to rest him the remainder of the regular season. Now, as much as it sucks to lose Jalen Waddle, it's better than him playing hurt, and absolutely killing our fantasy day because we ended up starting him. So I guess that's a little bit of a silver lining. But obviously, we're firing up Tyreek Hill. If he's healthy and he's playing, he's in your fantasy lineup, even though this is a difficult matchup going up against Baltimore. They allow the 11th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but they do have multiple members of their secondary currently questionable to play here this week. But we also saw Brandon Ayuk go over 100 yards against this secondary last week as well. We never sit Tyreek Hill. I think we already know that. But what about for Baltimore? We got Odell Beckham, we got Zay Flowers, and all that momentum that OBJ gained a few weeks ago has all but faded here over the last 2 weeks. Only 3 receptions for a total of 27 receiving yards in his last 2 games combined. Zay Flowers is the only pass-catching option right now in this offense with any type of consistency. He's had 10-plus targets in 2 of the last 3 games he's played and touchdowns in 3 of his last 4. Plus, he's getting some work out of the slot, and we absolutely love guys who live in the slot. Now, matchup going up against Miami, they allow right around the league average when it comes to fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. It's much easier to throw on Miami than it is to run on Miami, and Zay Flowers once again this week could be Verge top 24. Which will then take us out to Buffalo for the Bills and the Patriots. And it's championship week. There is no way we're trusting any wide receiver in New England. They're all averaging under 6 fantasy points per game. None of them have finished inside the top 24 at their position more than 10% of their games this season, and it's on the road in Buffalo. I can't imagine too many people are really interested in the pass catchers at the wide receiver position in New England. But what about Buffalo? And I'm right here. I'm one of y'all, okay? I am definitely here with you guys. I have no idea why the Buffalo Bills have just completely gone away from Stefon Diggs. Over the last 6 games that Stefon Diggs has played, he is the wide receiver 55 in fantasy football and averaging only 7 fantasy points per game. He hasn't had a 100-yard receiving game since week 6. This is week 17. That's a problem. Gabe Davis, we already know he is 100% boom or bust. If you play Gabe Davis, you have to accept the fact that there's a chance that he scores only 1 fantasy point. But Stefon Diggs, he's supposed to be the safe and reliable guy that we just plug and play each and every week. Now a matchup going up against New England, they allow the 13th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Diggs has been a locked and loaded top 12 wide receiver for years. But with the way they've been utilizing him as of late, he's going to continue to fall down the rankings each and every week. Maybe more of a top 24 overall option right now. But what you do need to know, in championship week, if you've had enough and you bench Stefon Diggs and he happens to go off in a matchup that is not bad and you lose your championship because of it, you need to be prepared to live with that decision. Of course, it's all going to come down to what options you have to play in front of him, but it's always a huge risk to sit a high-performing stud who's been a stud for a long time. If it's my team, he's in my lineup, and if I lose because of it, at least I know I lost because I started my best overall players. I don't want to get too cute in championship week. Which then brings us out to Chicago, for the Bears and the Falcons. Will kick it off with Drake London. He's had 7 targets, 5 receptions, and 63 yards combined over his last 2 games played. That has to be one of the dumbest things going on right now in the NFL. His target share has actually gotten lower as the season has gone on. Jonnu Smith is getting more targets than Drake London. Hell, Van Jefferson only had 1 less target than Drake London did last week. Now Atlanta goes on the road where they're really not that good anyway, and they get to go up against a hot Chicago defense right now. In the 7 road games this year, Drake London is averaging 3 catches for 33 yards. Chicago allows the 13th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Now, I know the quarterback play hasn't been great in Atlanta most of the season, but this should be one of those situations that's really similar to what we see with the Jets and Garrett Wilson. Just hog the targets, throw your best player the football, and have him make plays happen. But that's not the case in Atlanta, not with Arthur Smith. And because of it, Drake London remains a risky Verge top 30 wide receiver, which is crazy to even say. How about DJ Moore on the other side? It wasn't a great week 16 for DJ Moore, but he did suffer an injury earlier. He came back into the game, but never really looked 100%. It was the fewest snaps he's played in a game since week 3. He's still averaging over 13.5 fantasy points per game, and he gets more targets in 1 game than Drake London gets in like 3 games. This matchup does suck. Though Atlanta is great against opposing wide receivers, even though it does help their numbers quite a bit because they face the likes of Indianapolis without Michael Pittman, Carolina, and the Jets over the last month. But Atlanta currently allows the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers in the league. You got to expect we see a lot of DJ Moore here this week, though. Both Cole Kmet and Darnell Mooney are questionable to play. DJ Moore probably going to be a top 20 option for me in week 17. Which then takes us out to Houston. For the Texans and the Titans, we'll start off with DeAndre Hopkins. But as of right now, we don't even know who the hell his quarterback is going to be. Will Levis is expected to start practicing once again here this week, but Tennessee has been eliminated from everything. So who's to say that they either don't stick with Ryan Tannehill or maybe even give Malik Willis some snaps? Now, obviously, the ceiling is going to be highest for DeAndre Hopkins if Will Levis is his quarterback. Because last week we saw that whopping 20 yards that Ryan Tannehill was able to deliver to DeAndre Hopkins. Earlier in the year when Tannehill was his quarterback, he averaged 5 catches for 50 yards. Not a very high ceiling. But we also know that Malik Willis hasn't really done great in this passing offense in his limited opportunities throughout his career. Houston is right around league average when it comes to fantasy points per game allowed to opposing wide receivers. DeAndre Hopkins probably going to be a Verge top 30 guy for me, but with the unknown quarterback situation, the lack of opportunities overall in this offense, I can't feel real good about it, especially on the road against Houston, who still has to win this ball game to have a remote chance at the playoffs. It's going to be a risky start of DeAndre Hopkins. How about for the guys there in Houston? We are anxiously, and all caps, anxiously awaiting to hear the availability of CJ Stroud this week. Is he going to return or not? If we don't, we get a revolving door of quarterbacks between Davis Mills and Case Keenum, which sucks because this matchup isn't that bad. Nico didn't play in this game just 2 weeks ago. In that game, Noah Brown did have 8 catches for 82 yards and a touchdown, though. With a healthy Stroud, Nico could be a top 15 option in this offense this week. With any other quarterback, he's more top 25. Noah Brown, on the other hand, regardless, with now Nico being healthy, is more of a Verge top 30 wide receiver. Now, Tennessee does allow the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and Stroud is expected to practice once again here this week. Hopefully we hear something soon so we know his status heading into the weekend. which will then take us out to Indianapolis for the Colts and the Raiders. And for the Las Vegas Raiders, last week sucked from a fantasy perspective as well. When your quarterback only throws for 62 yards in an entire game, that spells disaster for the wide receivers on the roster. Now, I don't think anyone was expecting one catch for 4 yards, but I think we maybe expected a little bit more than that. We all know the ceiling is lower, right? We've seen the lower ceiling all year long. I actually kind of get a kick out of the comments every once in a while on videos when people come and complain about Davante Adams. We said to avoid the guy all offseason. You took him in like the first or second round. You're kind of committed to him. Sorry, but we tried to warn you. But now he gets another difficult matchup here this week going up against Indianapolis. They allow the 7th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. And unfortunately, it's a lot of the same here once again. Davante Adams, probably a top 24 overall play, but he's no longer safe. He's not someone that you can just lock in and feel good about. But on the other hand, after last week's performance, nowhere really to go but up. As for Jakobi Meyers, he probably is a little bit safer at this time in this offense. The problem, the ceiling still stays ridiculously low for him, and it really keeps him in that wide receiver 30 to 40 range. But what about in Indianapolis? Now for Michael Pittman, we thought we were going to have him last week, right? He'd cleared concussion protocol, he was set to start, and then late in the week, the symptoms returned, he was thrown back into protocol, and everyone had to scatter for another wide receiver. Now, as of right now, he's still in the concussion protocol. We don't know if we're going to have him or not. I will tell you this, if he's active, he's in our fantasy lineups. He's been one of the safest wide receivers in fantasy football the entire year of 2023. So really the question comes down to Josh Downs or Alec Pierce. Are either one of them fantasy viable if Michael Pittman is ruled out? And volume-wise, they probably should be. Alec Pierce had 7 targets, Josh Downs 9 in that game last week without Michael Pittman. The problem is they turned it into a combined 9 catches for 69 yards. Not a whole lot of production. And this isn't a great matchup for them going up against Las Vegas. They allow slightly less than the league average to opposing wide receivers, but have definitely been playing better second half of the season. We just don't have anything here that screams safe start in Indianapolis, especially in championship week if Michael Pittman is ruled out. 2 wide receivers that average under 8 fantasy points per game, minimal finishes all year long inside the top 24 at the position, a super low touchdown upside, and the matchup isn't great. I'm really preferring just to stick to Michael Pittman, and that's it in Indianapolis. Which then takes us down to Jacksonville for the Jags and the Carolina Panthers. Let's talk about Adam Thielen, because normally I wouldn't want any part of this Carolina offense on Championship Sunday, with maybe the exception of Chuba Hubbard, and even that one's a little bit iffy in this matchup. But so far, over the last 3 weeks, Carolina remembered that they had Adam Thielen on their roster. He's had at least 7 targets a game over those last 3 games, and 10+ fantasy points in 2 of his last 3 games played. Now, a lot of people are going to see the big plays last week of DJ Chark in week 16 and think that he is the guy. But is he really? Or is that just a blip on the radar? Because he hadn't had over 56 yards receiving in a game since week 3 prior to week 16. Chark is a guy that I'm actually probably going to look at if I'm making any DFS lineups, maybe throwing in some underdog pick'ems. I love this matchup for DJ Chark. I just don't know if I want to take the risk in my fantasy championship, because the upside is definitely there going against Jacksonville. They allow the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and they are much harder to run on than they are to throw on. Now, these aren't some smash starts. Any of these guys in Carolina, none of them are absolutely safe, but the potential in the matchup is there. Even Adam Thielen himself is going to be a Verge top 30 play in this offense, and he'll be the highest ranked of them all. How about on the other side of the football, we got Calvin Ridley, and we got Zay Jones, maybe. When it comes to the Jags, though, all eyes are on the injury report, because right now, Trevor Lawrence is dealing with an AC joint sprain in his right shoulder. Something similar to what we saw Derek Carr deal with earlier in the season. He played, but nothing was deeper down the field. Now, Zay Jones, he's trying to come back and return from a hamstring injury here this week. Head coach Doug Peterson has already come out, and he said he's pretty optimistic optimistic about that return. It is somewhat concerning, though, that Jacksonville has already brought in another quarterback. They've brought over Matt Barkley. But no matter who the quarterback is going to be, this is not going to be an easy matchup. Carolina allows the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Defending the passing game is something they do really well in Carolina. I'm hoping we hear about Trevor Lawrence soon, but in the meantime, I plan to be without him. Now, obviously, CJ Beathard has to throw it to someone. And with Zay Jones not 100% healthy and no Christian Kirk, you have to think that Calvin Ridley sees the large target share once again. However, I would have thought that last week as well with a healthy Trevor Lawrence, and yet Ridley had 0 targets in the first half and 1 rushing attempt for -12 yards. Because of all the weirdness in this overall offense right now and the questions at the quarterback position, Ridley probably going to be at most a top 24 wide receiver for me here this week, and then we'll wait and find out whether or not we're going to have a 100% healthy Zay Jones or not. The last time we saw CJ Beathard on the field, Zay Jones was kind of his guy, but that's something to pay attention to. We'll address it later in the week. Which then takes us out to New York for the Giants and the Rams. And for the Los Angeles Rams, I don't care what happened last week. I don't care where they're playing this week. I don't care who they play. There is no way that we can sit either Cooper Kupp or Puka Nacua in the fantasy championship. Sure, Puka had a huge game last week, but Cooper Kupp actually saw more targets. He had 12 of them. So it's not like he's not involved in this offense. They just couldn't connect there on a few of those passes. So we chalk it up as a Puka day. Cool. They're both always involved and they're both always started in fantasy football. But what about Demarcus Robinson? We've mentioned his name on this show now for multiple weeks, and the guy continues to go out there and perform above expectations. He's had touchdowns now in 4 straight ball games, but let's be honest, he is very touchdown dependent. If he doesn't score the touchdowns, he's not going to give you a great fantasy day because Puka and Kupp are soaking up all the targets. While both Puka and Kupp are 10 plus per game, Demarcus Robinson hovering right around 6 targets or so. But this is a great matchup to perform once again going up against the Giants. They allow the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Overall, this Rams offense is healthy and arguably one of the hottest right now in the NFL. This is a must-win game for the Rams. If they lose, their odds of making the playoffs go from 65% down to 25%. Call me crazy, but all 3 Ram wide receivers could be inside my top 30 in week 17. On the other side of the football, not so much. Cool. Darius Slayton had himself a big game in week 16. I'm still not considering him here in week 17. This trio that you see right here on the screen right now has a combined 5 fantasy startable days on the entire season. They all average under 7 fantasy points per game. Touchdowns are few and far between in New York. Now they're going with Tyrod Taylor instead of Tommy DeVito, and these games are all meaningless to them because they're already eliminated. It's not worth the potential downside that they all have to put in your fantasy lineups during your fantasy championship. Which will then bring us out to Philly for the Eagles and the Arizona Cardinals. For Arizona, I really don't think that we can look at anyone in Arizona aside from Kyler Murray, Trey McBride, and James Conner. In case you didn't notice, none of them play wide receiver because none of the wide receivers in Arizona have done anything consistent in months. Which absolutely sucks because this is a great matchup. There is no team in the NFL that allows more points to opposing wide receivers than the Philadelphia Eagles. Yet, we don't have hardly anything to choose from here in Arizona. As of right now, Hollywood Brown is still questionable and he hasn't played in weeks. And no wide receiver in Arizona has had over 45 yards receiving in a game in the last month of the season. If I had to go with one, I'm going with Big Dortch Energy Greg Dortch only because his floor is the safest of all of them. Does that mean that I want to start Greg Dortch in my championship? No. But if I had to choose one, there's not many other options out there to choose from. As for Philadelphia, this one is a no-brainer here. There's no way we sit A.J. Brown or Devontae Smith in a must-win game at home against the Arizona Cardinals. Both these wide receivers inside the top 15 overall wide receivers on the season. Both of them averaging over 12 fantasy points per game. Both of them have matchup winning upside. They absolutely have to be in your lineups here once again this week. which will then take us down to Tampa Bay. For the Bucs and the Saints, we'll start off with Chris Olave because at this point of the season, he's a must-start in every fantasy lineup, but it was great last week to see Derek Carr really force-feed him some targets. But part of me, if I'm being completely honest, I really want to ride the lightning here this week of Rashid Shaheed, but you need to know, eye contact, listen up right here, this is not safe. This is total boom or bust. If you're looking at your matchup and maybe you're missing a few key pieces, maybe you need to shoot for some extra upside, that's where we're looking at Rashid Shaheed. I really try to reserve that feeling for really good matchups, and Tampa Bay is one of those matchups. They allow the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and that Tampa Bay offense continues to put up points, which means New Orleans and Derek Carr are going to have to continue to throw the ball all 4 quarters. Chris Olave, he's going to be a top 15 play. Shaheed, he may make my top 30 as a high risk, high reward type play, but we need a touchdown from him. If he doesn't score a touchdown, we're going to be in a world of hurt. But like I said, if you're chasing some upside, maybe you feel like you'll be playing from behind after a Thursday or a Saturday game, Rashid Shaheed could be that guy with that added upside. On the other side of the football, we got the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and we already know that we start Mike Evans each and every week of our fantasy season, especially in a game when the Saints aren't going to have Marshawn Lattimore. That's great. Right now, Mike Evans is the overall wide receiver 3 in fantasy football, averaging just over 15 fantasy points per game, and has finished as a top 24 wide receiver in 73% of his games this season. But what about Chris Godwin? His targets have absolutely skyrocketed here over the last 3 games. He's now had 11 plus targets in 3 straight games, and we start wide receivers around here that get double-digit targets a week. Now a matchup going up against New Orleans, they allow the 8th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. But when you play teams like the Giants, the Panthers twice, the Falcons, the Patriots, the Titans, none of those teams are absolutely killing it at the wide receiver position. It's going to make your numbers look a little bit better. Plus, this is a must-win game for Tampa Bay. They can clinch the division in a home game here this week. Mike Evans, he's locked into my top 10. Chris Godwin, he'll be in my top 30 as well. Which then takes us out to Washington for the Commanders and the San Francisco 49ers. Let's kick it off with the San Francisco 49ers because a lot of people are worried after what they saw last week going up against Baltimore. I'm not that worried if I'm being completely honest. Brandon Ayuk still had 113 yards in that game, and Debo led the team with 12 targets. Both of them are top 13 wide receivers overall on the season. They're averaging over 13 fantasy points per game, and now they get a matchup going up against Washington, who allows the 2nd most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. One injury we are paying attention to, though, is offensive lineman Trent Williams. That's Brock Purdy's blind side right there. We need him healthy on the field, but right now, he's questionable with a groin injury, so definitely pay close attention to that one. But when it comes to the wide receiver position, I'm locking in both these guys in a great matchup going up against Washington here this week. Plus, San Francisco needs to keep winning as well. They're trying to get that number 1 overall seed in the NFC. How about on the other side of the football, Terry McLaurin, Jahan Dotson, Curtis Samuel? At least we already know that it's not going to be Sam Howell at quarterback. It's going to be Jacoby Brissett. And honestly, I think that's a good thing for Terry McLaurin. Brissett likes to go down the field. He likes to force feed his number 1 wide receiver. We've already seen him do it at times this season, and he did it all last year with Amari Cooper. That really fits McLaurin over Samuel, in my opinion, in this matchup. Even though I don't love this matchup going up against San Francisco. They do allow the 14th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and they are easier to throw on than run on. But this run game is pretty banged up right now in Washington. Both Brian Robinson and Chris Rodriguez questionable to play in this game. Can San Francisco maybe pull back a little bit, not having to worry about any sort of run game, and really that take away from some of the passing game? That's what has me a little bit worried. This is a must-win game for San Francisco, though, and also, it's a Chase Young revenge game. Does he go absolutely ham in this game and rack up multiple sacks? I think the one thing that we can all agree on, though, is more than likely, like every single week, Washington is going to be playing from behind and having to throw the ball all 4 quarters, meaning that Terry McLaurin's probably going to be inside my top 30 here, but barely this week. Which will then take us out to Seattle for the Seahawks and the Pittsburgh Steelers. We'll kick it off in Pittsburgh with Deontay Johnson and George Pickens. And let me ask you a question. Is Mason Rudolph good, I mean, I'm going to go with not really, even though he played really well just last week, but I do believe it was more because of the big playability of George Pickens than that of the dimes of Mason Rudolph. The biggest issue here with both wide receivers in Pittsburgh is their floors are super low. It's not like we can sit here and say, you know what? I'm going to gamble on the upside of George Pickens because even if he doesn't hit, his floor is going to give me 8 to 10 fantasy points a week in a good matchup. That's just not something we can say with either one of these guys. Their floors are that low, but this is a good matchup going up against Seattle. They allow the 12th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Seattle, though, is easier to run on than they are to throw on, which means Mike Tomlin going to be running that rock on the ground. When I look at this overall matchup, George Pickens and his big play upside is really the only way I would go if needed, but you need to know there's nothing safe about the start of George Pickens. There's a lot of risk, a lot of boom or bust potential. On the other side of the football, we continue to throw in DK Metcalf each and every week. The guy has 6 touchdowns now over his last 6 games played. Would have loved to see more than 6 targets last week, though, if I'm being completely honest. It really keeps him touchdown dependent each and every week, which I absolutely hate at the wide receiver position. But we see the big plays of Higgins against this Pittsburgh team last week, and it makes us believe that DK has a shot here this week as well. As for Tyler Lockett and JSN, they continue to be nothing more than safer flex options in most fantasy leagues. They're going to hover right around 8 to 12 fantasy points a game with the occasional touchdown, but I do love that this game is at home and is a must-win game for the Seahawks as well. They're playing for something. They're trying to get into the playoffs. In Pittsburgh right now, they allow right around the league average to opposing wide receivers when it comes to fantasy points per game. I really see Lockett and JSN more in that 30 to 40 range, where DK is probably going to be in my top 15. Which then brings us out to Denver for the Broncos and the Los Angeles Chargers. Let's kick it off in LA because right now we're really waiting to hear about Keenan Allen. Is he going to be available this week or no? If he plays, we automatically know that he goes into our fantasy lineup. That's not much of a question. So what about Josh Palmer? He tied a season high in targets just last week with 8, but can only turn into 5 catches for 47 yards against Buffalo. However, I do love to see that uptick in targets. That's definitely something to pay attention to. But now they get a matchup going up against Denver. They allow the 10th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. And Josh Palmer plays on the outside, which means at times in this matchup, he's going to draw coverage from top defensive back Patrick Surtain. That's going to hurt the overall ceiling and potential of Josh Palmer in this matchup. Now, if Keenan plays, not overly concerned since he really spends the majority of his time coming out of the slot. For now, though, I kind of look at Josh Palmer as a verge top 30 wide receiver until we get more information about Keenan Allen. All right, how about for Denver? What the hell do we do in Denver now? They've benched Russell Wilson for Jarrett Stidham. Russ's days in Denver are all but numbered at this point. I'm convinced that he's probably not going to play again for the Denver Broncos. Plus, we have Courtland Sutton, who's still technically in concussion protocol and questionable to play. Do we really want to sit back and trust Jerry Jeudy with Jarrett Stidham under center when Jerry Jeudy has only scored over 10 fantasy points in a game one time all year long? But this matchup is absolutely great going against the Chargers. They allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. This matchup is great, but there's no guarantee that Jarrett Stidham is going to lock on to Courtland Sutton in the red zone like Russ did if Courtland Sutton even plays. Every single week, it seems like in Denver, we have a bunch of randoms out there catching passes. Now, I will say if Courtland Sutton sits in this ballgame, Jerry Jeudy will be verge top 30 for me. If Sutton plays, he'll be the guy up inside my top 30 still. Which then brings us out to Kansas City. For the Chiefs and the Bengals, we'll start it off in Cincinnati because T. Higgins is coming off his 2nd big game in a row now while picking up the slack for an injured Jamar Chase. Higgins now has back-to-back games with at least 20 fantasy points and is the clear number 1 overall option in this offense. As for Tyler Boyd, he did see an increase in targets as well, but he's more of a solid chain mover, right? They're not doing the big plays down the field to Tyler Boyd. Now a matchup going up against Kansas City, though, is not going to be ideal. They allow the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and we just saw them almost shut out Davante Adams. This is another one of those games where there must-win territory for both teams. Not ideal for the Bengals to be on the road in Arrowhead, but for T. Higgins, he's still going to be a top 24 option, where Tyler Boyd probably hovering in the top 36 to 40 or so. How about for Kansas City? We've said it here for weeks. If a Kansas City wide receiver gets 9+ targets a game, he's locked into your flex spot almost each and every week at least. Well, now he's coming off a game in which he saw a season-high 12 targets and has touchdowns in 3 of his last 5 games played. This game being at home against a very vulnerable Cincinnati secondary is definitely another opportunity for Rashee Rice to have a great matchup. Cincinnati does allow the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and look at what Mason Rudolph and George Pickens did against them just last week. Plus, Kadarius Toney and Justin Watson are both questionable to play at the time of this recording, making Rashee Rice once again a top 20 option in Week 17. Which then brings us to the last game of Week 17, Sunday Night Football. No Monday Night Football here this week. The Minnesota Vikings and Green Bay Packers. And for Green Bay, luckily it sounds like we could have Jayden Reed back this week, which is absolutely great. He is by far the top wide receiver option second half of the season here in Green Bay. We also know that Christian Watson, Fantasy Bigfoot, perma-questionable, as well as Dontavian Wicks this week as well. And this is a great time to get Jayden Reed back. Minnesota allows the 10th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. We see Jayden Reed in the passing game. We see him getting carries out of the backfield, and Minnesota has been able to put up a lot of points here as of late. With Jaire Alexander not even playing in this game, Minnesota could do it again, which could force Green Bay to have to throw the ball maybe more than they even want to. For whatever reason, they're still not force-feeding Romeo Doubs. He did have a solid day last week, 4 catches for 79 yards and a touchdown against a very tough Carolina defense, but still, this week, Jayden Reed going to be the safest and highest-ranked wide receiver in Green Bay. As for Minnesota, I want to label this the Justin Jefferson Savior Week. You drafted him early in fantasy football. He started off super hot. You were pumped. Then he got hurt, and you've been without him for most of the season. Then, more than likely, he helped get you into this championship matchup with a big game last week. Now a matchup going up against Green Bay. They allow the 15th most fantasy points per game, but like I just mentioned, they're not going to have Jaire Alexander to put on Justin Jefferson. Plus, on top of all of that, TJ Hawkinson done for the year with a torn ACL, and Jordan Addison is currently questionable with an ankle injury. Then you add in the fact this game is at home on primetime TV. I would not be surprised if Justin Jefferson goes ham once again. But we already know that we start Justin Jefferson. Is there anyone else there? If we don't have Jordan Addison, what do? KJ Osborne has some sneaky upside if we do not have Jordan Addison this week. Probably a little bit more of a deeper option. Those leagues that start 3 wide receivers, maybe have multiple flex spots, maybe you got some injuries you're dealing with. That's when we consider KJ Osborne, but he's not going to be inside my top 30. All right, that's going to do it for my wide receiver start and sit video here for Week 17 fantasy football. Hopefully I was able to give you some information to start making some lineup decisions, but don't forget our rankings will still be out Thursday prior to Thursday Night Football to help you make all of those final decisions. Now, once again, just a reminder, we will be here Week 18 as well, so if you happen to play next week, which absolutely sucks, I hate Week 18, we'll be here for you to help make those lineup decisions as well. But I'm going to go ahead and get out of here for the day. Hopefully you guys enjoy the rest of your day. Good luck this weekend, and then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.